So, at any rate, talking about the second coming of Christ, and I've tried to advocate that Matthew 24 correlates to Revelation, and so the tribulation in the book of Revelation starts at chapter 6, ends in chapter 18, and then immediately after that, Christ descends on a white horse and further describe what we were just talking about. And so the chronology is the same. Christ comes after the tribulation, not before, comes after, and then in the chronology of Revelation, what chapter comes after 19? Which has what description in it? The millennium. So Christ comes, and then it immediately starts describing this 1,000-year reign where Satan is put in a cage and the saints rule and reign with Christ. And then we'll come back to chapter 21 and 22 in a bit. But as we continue in the Olivet Discourse, so 29 through 31 is the second coming. Then Jesus begins to give some lessons through some parables. And you know that when he was talking to the Pharisees, he started using parables so that they couldn't understand. But parables for the believers are ways that we can understand, and so he's trying to drive a new idea by laying down thoughts along something that you do understand. And so the first one is the parable of the fig tree. Now is the time for application. All that we've been learning is just a bunch of facts or possible scenarios, and you say, well, what's that mean to my life? What's that mean to my life? Well, Jesus took most of his time in this sermon to focus on application, and that's what the rest of this chapter and chapter 25 is all about. What are we going to do with it? So he says, learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Learn, the word is math, repetitious study, figure it out. Now, fig trees were a normal staple in the hillsides of Israel. They grow to a height of 20 feet or so, equally wide in their branches, a very important food source. But the unique thing about the fig tree is that the fruit grows first, and then the leaves. And that's one of the reasons why Jesus cursed one in another story. But the issue is when you see the fig tree with leaves, the fruit is already there. It's about ready to happen. It causes you to pay attention. It tracks you to the fruit. Now, in times past, premillennialists have tried to make a case that the fig tree represents Israel. And so when Israel becomes a nation, this was before Israel became a nation. This is the way that prophecy always went. Israel's going to become a nation. And when they do, you'll know that within a short period of time, within a generation, all of these things are going to happen. But Israel is likened to grapes and other fruits, and there's no clear designation that the fig tree is representing specifically Israel. It's just, you got to imagine, Jesus is on the Mount of Olives, outside, looking at the city. There's an olive grove down below him. There's fig trees over here, and he just was a master teacher. And he said, "You see the trees? When you see their leaves are out." In fact, in a parallel passage, he says, "In any tree." So he's not really saying, he's not talking about Israel. He's just saying, when you see a tree, a fig tree with his leaves out, you know that summer's near. It's right around the corner. It's about ready to happen. Remember the birth pangs. It's coming. It's coming. It's coming. So when you see these things, pay attention. recognize that he is near. Verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not. And so here's another area where interpreters disagree. You might say they disagree on everything, which they do, but it says this generation will not pass. Well, like I said, early premillennialists believed when Israel became a nation that generation will not pass until all these things come true. But how long is a generation? The guy who discipled me, whom I love to death, we always argued about this because he believed that when Israel became a nation in 48, within a generation, the rapture was going to happen. So he argued the rapture was going to happen, which this isn't talking about the rapture. And so all during the 1970s, rapture's going to happen this year, it's going to happen that year, and then he changed his definition of a generation. A generation is really 20 years. It's how long it takes for a kid to have a kid. But then the generation was changed to 30 years, then 40 years, and now it's been 80 years, and by any definition, that's not a generation, that's a lifetime. So it's not talking about when Israel becomes a nation. It's just saying when you see all these signs, you know that I'm right around the corner. And the generation that he's talking about here is the generation that sees it. If you're alive during this time and you start seeing all these things that happened in Matthew 24, they happen within a 7-year period. The generation that sees that is going to see the return of Christ. I think that's all it's saying. You don't have to complicate it more than that. Verse 36, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. No one knows exactly the timing. That's why anytime somebody says that they know when it's going to come, back in 1988, there was a guy who wrote a pamphlet, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Had to Happen in 1988. And it didn't happen, and so he wrote another one, Why It Needs to Happen in 1989. And it's like, and we're still here. And Harold Camping did the same thing in the 2000s. And the minute they do that, you might as well stop listening. Nobody knows the day and hour. And even Christ, in his humanity, Christ was omniscient, but he limited the use of his divinity at certain points, and this is one of them. As his man side, he did not have the permission anyway to declare when this was going to be. It's something that is fixed by the Father, according to Acts chapter 1 and verse 7. He's the one who's going to reveal when he returns. But when you see these things, you have a right to say, hey, it's near, it's coming at the door. Don't go predicting days, but so these following parables, their main emphasis is to stress the need for watchfulness. We need to be ready, and that's why I say it's important that you understand as much as you can about future things, because it keeps your heart ready. And these parables are going to tell you why that's important. You ask, why didn't he tell us when? Why couldn't he be a little more precise? Well, can you answer that? If you knew the Lord wasn't going to return for sure for another 20 years, what would you do? Right, if you know what year he's going to come back, you say, well, I'll get right 6 months before, which a lot of people think they can do. I don't need to live correctly now. I've got time. I'll straighten out. Let yourself go. So the call is for vigilance and a warning against spiritual apathy. So look at verse 37. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, They were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. They were apathetic. During Noah's day, it was a day when nobody paid attention. Noah preached for 120 years, warning what was going to happen. He was building a ship that was larger than an ocean liner. And the only ones that listened to him were animals, and there was only 2 of them of each kind. Nobody was listening. They were just going on in their life. And you got to understand something here. I might lose a couple of you here because of my take on this, but verse 38. For in those days before the flood, who was eating and drinking, marrying and giving? The people on the ark or the other people? The other people, right? They were eating and drinking, going on just like they were. They were unaware. Was Noah unaware? No, Noah knew what was going on. He's preaching to all these people. Until the flood came and swept them all away. Who's the them? The unbelievers. And then he said there'll be 2 in the field, and one will be taken and one left. There's 2 women at the grinding at the mill, and one will be taken and the one left. So who is taken? It's the unbeliever who's taken. This is not the rapture. The unbeliever is taken away into judgment, and the believer is left to populate the earth. In Noah's day, he was the one who was left. The unbelievers were washed away. And so this is the opposite of the rapture. The rapture, the believer goes and the unbeliever stays to receive the wrath of God. At the second coming, the unbeliever is taken away into judgment. In fact, the parallel passage to this is found in Luke chapter 17. If you say, well, where were they taken? Luke chapter 17, at the end of the chapter. They said to them, Where, Lord, where are they taken? And he said, Where the corpse is and the vultures gather. They're taken away, basically, to the valley of Megiddo to receive judgment. And so I submit to you that this is not a rapture passage. This is the result of Christ's return to earth. Yes, he gathers the elect, but they're still on the earth because we're going to have a judgment of the goat and the sheep in a moment, and the others are taken away into judgment. And so that's why there's confusion about the rapture, and why maybe you can see if we have a tribulation, I'm advocating the pre-tribulational rapture, but there are those very sound people that believe in the post-tribulational rapture, and one of the reasons why they do is because they take this as the rapture, which happened after the tribulation, right? Because immediately after the tribulation, Jesus came, and then he starts giving this parable, and so they say that the rapture happens here, we go up, and then we come right back down. But if that's the case, there isn't time for somebody to ask the question, what happens to believers after the rapture? We go before the judgment seat of Christ, and we go to the feast, the wedding feast of the Lamb that's going on during that 7 years. There's no time to do that. There's no time to be judged. But that's one of the reasons why they believe the rapture is at the end of the tribulation. But the 2 in the field, the woman left, it's an opposite mirror of the rapture. And that the whole overall purpose of the parable is you better be ready. You don't know when it's going to come. And so the next parable is the same thing, Matthew 24, 42 through 51. Therefore be on alert, for you don't know which day the Lord is coming. That's the point. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would have not allowed him in the house and broken into. And for this reason, you got to be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at any hour. Now, some people object that Christ is likened to a thief, but all the illustration is, no, he's not saying he's a thief. He's just saying that a thief takes you unaware. But if you're on the ball, you're watching the main entry. Now, the easiest way to get in a house is through the main door. And so someone who knows something is going to happen, if crime rate is up, you up your alertness, and so you're watching the front door. And everybody knows, you set up your house so that if something happens, you have a gun underneath your table that's taped to the bottom of the table just in case somebody comes in. You go to the cupboard to your sugar bowl and your .357 Magnums behind there. You open your closet door and your shotgun's right above the right. You're ready for them. The point here is the thief is going to come in an unlikely spot. They're actually digging through the walls. They didn't have many windows and things, and it's easy to defend the door, so they would dig in through the wall. So most of us lock our main doors and our windows, but we forget to lock our cellars. That's a good way to get in, unless it's my house. You don't want to try to come in through my cellar. I have 4 gravestones lined up at the bottom of the stairs. I do. I can't even get a serviceman to come down and work on the furnace. And the thieves it's too spooky. They won't do it. But this is a call not only to be prepared in the big areas of your life, but to be prepared in the small areas of your life. But the blindness and the stubbornness of that day, they're going to leave the door wide open. They aren't even expecting anything. In verse 43 says you have to be ready. It's repeated constantly throughout these parables. How is it that we can be ready as believers, or how they can be ready in that day, but also by application, how can we be ready? Are we supposed to dig bunkers and hide food like they did during the millennial scare? Remember that? The year 2000? The warning is to be ready spiritually. It's a readiness that all can achieve. It's spiritual preparation. Is the blood applied to your life? That's the key. Years ago in the southern state, a woman was shopping and 2 or 3 young men were standing around, and they knew she was a Christian, and so they began to taunt her, and they said, "We hear you believe Jesus is going to come back." And she replied, I sure am. "Do you really believe he's coming?" They said. And she said, "Sure as you're born." And they said, "Well, you'd better hurry home and get ready. He might be on his way." And she turned to them and she said, "I don't have to get ready. I keep ready." You see, that's what's being called for. You can be ready. There's nothing you have to do to make sure you have enough food to get through the next 6 months. If we do get a time like that, or if I'm wrong and you do go through the tribulation, you're not going to be able to store enough food to get you through anyway. And people are going to come and steal it from you, and they're going to kill you when they find out. Like, I already have people snooping around my house. It's not going to work. God will take care of you physically in those days. You don't have to worry about it. What you need to worry about is, are you right with Him? And if you're right with Him, you're not going to want to just store food away for yourself and not give it to anybody else. You just can't get away with it. So He's saying, be ready, be ready. And then He gives another parable in verse 48, I believe. 47. But if that evil slave says, starting in verse 45, who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is the slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. So there's a parable. There's a faithful household steward who is making sure that everybody has what they need as they need it. He's preparing food. It's the imagery of the sword and the thrall. He's always ready. He's working, but he's ready to defend. That kind of person God is going to reward. On the other hand, the unfaithful servant, it says, but if the evil slave says, hey, my master's not coming back for a long time, and he begins to beat his fellow slaves and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, in an hour that he does not know, and he will cut him in pieces and assign him in the place of the hypocrites, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. In other words, the person who isn't expectant, isn't waiting, what's he do? He goofs off. Christ isn't coming back anytime soon. And so I'm going to invest in this thing that has nothing to do with God's kingdom. I'm just going to do what I want to do. And I'll get ready at the last minute. But when you're drunk, you don't see what's going on around you. And so he's contrasting. Those who stay alert, he's going to reward. Those who goof off and just don't care, it's going to be too late when he shows up. There's a fable about 3 apprentice devils who were working under Satan, and they were talking, and Satan asked them how they were going to work, and the first one said, I'll tell you, I'll tell them that there is no God. And Satan said, that's not going to work. They'll not be deluded, because deep down they know there is a God. And the second said, well, I'll tell men that there is no hell. And Satan answered, you will deceive no one that way, because men even know deep down that there is a hell. And the third man said, I'll just tell them there's no hurry. Bingo, Satan said. You will ruin men by the thousands. The most dangerous of all delusions is that there's plenty of time. And so that's the gist of that particular parable. And then chapter 25 is the famous parable or story of the 10 virgins. We ask ourselves, why doesn't Christ come back now? It doesn't make sense. And yet God has a greater plan. His timing is excellent. He knows what he's doing. In her book, Today's Good Word, Ethel Sutton told a story about a young British soldier who was blinded in battle. He was a trained musician, and so after he recovered his injury, he spent a lot of time playing the piano for the wounded in a London hospital. He sometimes wondered if anyone was paying attention to his music. He heard trampling of feet, people coming and going, visitors and so forth. But he always put his best effort, and he played the best that he could every single night for years. And then one day, when he paused to rest, he heard somebody nearby clapping, and turning his sightless eyes, he asked, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am your king." See, that's why we keep praying. We can't see him, but he sees us. And that should be enough to motivate us to keep going. So in the middle of his discussion of his signs of coming back, he makes it clear that there's going to be a gap of time before it actually happens. And so he talks about the virgins at a wedding, verse 1. The kingdom of heaven will be comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet their bridegroom. The kingdom of heaven, that great millennial earthly realm, is comparable to a wedding. You see, in a Jewish wedding, the bridegroom, the groom is the center of attention, not the bride. You know, the women's family didn't have to foot the bill like they do now. They were just glad somebody would take their daughter off their hands. But the way that a Jewish wedding took place was that you were matched up as a child usually, and then when you got older, usually 14, 15 years old, you were engaged for a year where you had to do with each other but not physically, so they could prove that you had been pure. And then it could be more than a year. It could be a lot of time because the groom was away building a house, establishing his life, and he would come back, and then the formal wedding would take place, and he would bring the bride back to his home. Well, in preparation and waiting, the bride would pick bridesmaids, and in this case, there were 10. And the 10 is a number that represents representation. You know, it takes 10 jurors, or 12, but it takes 10 men to be a synagogue. It takes 10 to witness something, and so there are 10 virgins that are waiting for the groom to come back, and they're the ones who announce when he's coming down the road, and it could be at any time. In fact, a lot of times they came at midnight, verse 6. At midnight there was a shout, "Behold, the bridegroom comes." But I want to back up to verses 2 through 5. And 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were prudent. For when the foolish took their lamps, they didn't take any oil with them. The prudent took oil in flasks along with their lamps. Now, while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep. It's not bad that you get tired. Both sets got tired. But some weren't prepared for when the groom was coming. They didn't have any oil in their lamps. And so they couldn't do their job, and they couldn't announce the coming. And at midnight, verse 6, "Behold, the bridegroom come out to meet him." Then all these virgins rose and trimmed their lamps, and the foolish said to the prudent, "Hey, give me some of your oil. My lamp's going out." But the prudent answered, I can't. No, there will not be enough for any of us if I do that. And that's the point. To give it to them, then nobody has any lights, and then everything's in the dark. It wasn't that they were being selfish. That was their role. And so the groom comes at midnight when you don't expect him, when you're kind of half asleep, but you still got to be ready. In fact, there's a ministry called the Midnight Call that highlights this particular passage, and it's about prophecy, and it's worth delving into. But half of them were ready, and half of them were not. And so again, the point of the parable is you got to be ready at all times. You don't know when he's going to come. He might come today, he might come tomorrow, might come at midnight. But are you ready? That's the main thought. Are you ready? Verse 13 is, "Be on the alert then, for you don't know the day nor the hour." Then there's the parable of the talents in chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. Someone said it may be a hard thing for an egg to become a bird. It's a jolly sight harder for it to learn to fly while it is still in an egg. We are like eggs today, and we either must be hatched or go bad. I don't know what that has to do with anything. But another parable is here to stress the responsibility of the believer. They're teaching us to watch. And so, verses 14 through 15. "For it is just like a man about to go on a journey who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey." And you probably know the story, because we like preaching on these kind of things because they have a lot of applications that we can make. But the talent was a form of money, not a personal talent. It's a weight. And so let us say, for our thinking, that it equals $2,000 if it was a silver talent. And so one person received 10,000, one received 4, and one received $2,000. And so immediately, verse 16, the one who had received 5 talents went and traded them, and he gained another 5. In the same manner, the one who had received 2 did the same thing, and he got 2 more. But the one who received the 1 talent went away, and he dug it in the ground, and he hid his master's money. He just put it in a dirt bank. The man who received 5 talents and 2 invested the money, and they doubled it. And when the master came back, he rewarded them for what they did. Verse 19. Not after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them, and the one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more. And the master said, Master, you entrusted me with 5. See, I've gained 5 more. And he said, Well done, thou good and faithful slave. You're faithful with a few things. I'm going to put you in charge of many more things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the same thing happened with the man who invested the 2 talents. But he who received the 1 talent went away and dug it in the ground, hid his master's money. You'll notice that he was angry with him, that he didn't even put it in a regular bank so he could get some interest. That God is giving us information. He is giving us tips on what is going on so that we invest it in His kingdom. He wants us to be actively involved. But if we just say, well, I know my master's going to be hard on me, so I want to make sure I don't lose it. Here's your one. And the reason why he wasn't investing in it, because it wasn't his, really. He just knew he was going to have to give it back, so why am I going to waste my time with it? I'm going to invest my own stuff. That's the motivation. It's not my problem. This is his program. He shouldn't have given it to me if he wants it. If he wants more. And so it's that kind of attitude that he's confronting. And so he judges in verse 24. And the one who had received the 1 said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you didn't sow, gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and went away, hid your talent in the ground. And see, you have what's yours. But he said, You wicked, lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I didn't sow, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put money in the bank. In my arrival, you should have received money back with interest. Therefore, I'm going to take away the talent from him and give it to the one who had 10 talents. For to everyone who has shall more be given, and he shall have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away, and cast out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. You know, Lord, your standards are too high. I can't keep up with you. Instead of depending on, by faith, investing. So, the application is he doesn't want us to be lazy with what he's given us. And then verse 28, he took away that talent. The application to the Jewish remnant listening to Jesus' sermon is, don't just say you believe, but then live like it's not going to happen. It's a call to faithful service. And then verses 31 through 46. We've arrived at what's the close of the great Olivet Discourse. And, we go back to the beginning. He gave us the events that are going to happen, and now he's given us lessons. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all his angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Then he will sit on his glorious throne. I advocate to you, Jesus is not sitting on the Davidic throne right now. The Davidic throne is on the earth, in Jerusalem. In this kingdom, he's going to reign from Jerusalem and emanate out from there. And Israel is going to be the center of the kingdom. And they will become what the church is doing now. They will be the worship leaders of that kingdom. Zechariah tells us in that day, after Christ returns, 10 Gentiles will grab the hem of one Jew and say, take us to the temple, take us to worship, because the Jews were meant to be the leaders of worship, and they advocated that for the time being, and the church has been grafted in, and that's what we're doing. But in the millennium, Israel will receive her rightful role, and we will join her in worship. But before that can happen, there is a separating of the sheep and the goats, verse 32. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And the king will say to those on his right, Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat, and I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me, naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. You will notice that Christ separates them in nations, goats and sheep. We haven't determined what that means yet. But the response is, the righteous will answer him saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger, invite you, and naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick and in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say, Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these my brothers, you did it to me. The sheep don't quite understand or remember what Christ is talking about because they just did it naturally. They helped fellow Jewish people and believers. And they aren't doing it because they're looking to get kudos. And so they don't even remember. I still remember somebody in our church in the early days that struggled with their spiritual gifts. They couldn't identify them, and I'm talking to her, and she says, Wait, could you wait a minute? I see somebody over there that looks like they're about ready to cry, and I want to go talk to them. And I thought, here's somebody who has compassion and mercy, and they don't even know it. They just do it. On the other hand, the goats in verse 41, they will also say, they will say, when did we not feed you and not give you drink? They can't remember not doing it because it's not part of their nature. And so this is a separation of those who are truly believers and those who are not. There is a judgment on the earth that happens, and that's when the unbelievers cast into the eternal fire, as it says, that was prepared for the devil and his angels. Hell originally was prepared for them, but it will be joined by those who reject Christ. And so, this kind of ends what I wanted to share with you on the Olivet Discourse. But I want to end with this, but in case there's anybody teetering on the fence about whether you want to trust in Christ or not, that's the big question. Not whether we agree on all these specifics, but do you trust Christ enough to want to stand up for Him in these troubling days? The Reverend J.C. Hoover was a missionary to Jews in Denver, and he was riding in a car with a Jewish rabbi, and they drove up in front of the synagogue, and the rabbi said, Mr. Hoover, you Gentile Christians are looking for the second coming of your Savior, Jesus Christ, and we Jews are looking for the first coming of our Messiah. Who knows but that he might be the same person? And he paused. Mr. Hoover, how do you think we will recognize our Messiah? Quietly and prayerfully, Mr. Hoover read the words of the prophet Zechariah. They shall look on me, whom they have pierced. The rabbi silently got in his car and walked away. But will you walk away? Do you realize how God has sovereignly put all these things together? That we look on Him and not be ashamed of Him. And so the whole sermon is a final call for repentance before judgment must fall upon the earth. And the implication of these parables is, if you wait too long, it's going to be too late. The Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy is going to fall someday. Scientists go there every year to measure its descent, and it sinks a little bit more each year. And they report that the 179-foot tower moves about 1/20th of an inch every year. It's 17 feet out of plumb. They estimate that the 810-year-old tower will collapse on the nearby restaurant where they gather every year to study their findings. Will He find you ready? Could be today. Our Father, Lord, we ask that you would, at the very least, make us more aware of the depths of your word. We know we can't understand how it all fits together, and yet there's enough that we can. There's a direction in which it flows, and that we would trust that you are steering us along, and through your Holy Spirit giving us insight as to what that means in our life. Help us not to turn a blind eye to things because we initially can't understand it. Give us more understanding in these days until you return.